Hello, and welcome to POMA Does, a podcast produced by the Pennsylvania Osteopathic Medical Association. We provide a voice for osteopathic medicine and share insights on issues important to osteopathic physicians, residents, and students, as well as those who embrace the osteopathic philosophy. POMA's mission is to promote the distinctive philosophy and practice of osteopathic medicine in Pennsylvania for our members and their patients. Thanks for tuning in.
Hello, and welcome to the POMA podcast, next in the series POMA Does, sponsored by the Pennsylvania Osteopathic Medical Association. I'm Gene Battistella. I'm an osteopathic intern practicing in suburban Pittsburgh. I'm also a POMA Media Past President and District 8 Chairman. I'm involved in the POMA Influence Pillar, which deals with our advocacy and influence efforts. Our Influence Pillar is part of our strategic plan. It's made up of three committees: the Government Affairs Committee, or GAC, the Public Policy Committee, and our Political Action Committee, or POMPAC. Tonight, we have members of each of these groups with us here, and I'll introduce them now. Hans Zuckerman, he's the chair of our Government Affairs Committee. Andy Sandusky, he's our Executive Vice President of POMA, Public Policy and Association Affairs. And we have with us Andy Goodman and Catherine Connor of Milron and Goodman, our contract lobbyists. So Hans, why don't we start with you? Why don't you just give us a little bit of background about yourself, how you got involved in POMA, the board, and GAC, and tell us a little bit about what the GAC has been doing for osteopathic physicians here in Pennsylvania.
Sure. So I graduated residency from a small unopposed program in Lebanon, Pennsylvania in 2017. Went to work at that time for Geisinger. I've been with Geisinger ever since then as a family practice physician in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. I mostly became involved with POMA during my residency when I was part of the professional guidance committee in the central region. And from there, I continued on there. I was always interested in organized medicine. And like anyone else who asked me what the best way to get involved is, I just started showing up. I went to some of the district events. I showed up at the annual meeting in King of Prussia, and someone said, hey, you should, try to get a spot on the board. And before I knew it, there I was. And I think that started in about 2018. So I'm coming up on the end of my fourth year on the board. And for the last two, I've been chair or co-chair of the Government Affairs Committee. And that committee is something that I'm very passionate about, and lots of physicians are passionate about. Is it deals a lot with advocacy. So it's made up of a student, a resident, and then around 6 to 10 other members, several of which are non-voting, some of the executive committee president, and so far chair of the influence pillar in POMA. And our job is to provide guidance to the Board of Trustees on positions we should take concerning different political bills that are out there. And so we deal specifically with legislative action in Pennsylvania. We're generally not in the position of making widespread policy decisions for POMA. There's a committee that does a little bit more of that. What we do is specifically look most of the time at specific bills in the House or Senate of Pennsylvania and determine whether we should take a position at all, and if we should, what it should be. So the way we do that is we meet once a month, and that's more often than most committees, but we meet a little bit more frequently because you never really know what's going to come up. And some of our committee meetings can be pretty short. Most of them take about an hour. And a lot of what we do is what I always refer to as whack-a-mole. You never really know when an issue is going to come up, what it's going to be. So it's very hard to kind of be prospective and looking long term, because some bills suddenly become much more ready for prime time, and others that you think are really important might be on the back burner for a while. So every month we meet, and if we need to have an emergency session, we can do that too. Usually it's not necessary, but sometimes it has been. And we talk about whatever is important for us to discuss at that time. So the different bills that come up are usually introduced by Andy Sandusky. He keeps a pretty good eye on Capitol Hill and lets us know if there's any bills that he feels that are coming up, or if anyone reached out to him about. We also have Andy Goodman and Catherine Connor, who are our lobbyists, and they will also bring different bills to our attention when it's necessary, or they feel that it's important for us to decide or not decide to take a position on something. Sometimes issues come up from different committee members. We have members who are kind of all over the place. We try to have a good spread of younger physicians as well as more seasoned ones. We're lucky right now to have a couple members who are on the Osteopathic board for Pennsylvania, which is pretty convenient for us. They provide a lot of great perspectives on bills which would deal with the state board. We also will entertain, sometimes different POMA members will write to us and say, hey, I think this is really important. We should do something about it. And so we'll bring it up and discuss it. And we've even had people join the committee just by showing that they're more interested in being part of the legislative action. And then what happens is during the meetings, we discuss these, we decide what we want to do. Usually a member will make a motion to support, not support, table it for later, or just kind of ignore it if we don't think it's something we really need to weigh in on. And then those positions that we take as a committee are sent forward to the Board of Trustees. And it's not officially a POMA position until the Board of Trustees puts their final stamp of approval on it. Most of the time they agree with us, but sometimes they modify it slightly. Sometimes they shoot us down altogether. It just kind of depends on what's been going on. Overall, the goal of the committee really is to make sure that we are focusing on issues that are very germane to medicine. We really try to avoid getting out of that lane, which can be difficult at times because almost any subject you can come up with, you can tie back into health. So these days, there's lots of people who say, hey, maybe it's, criminal justice stuff, maybe it's environmental controls, maybe it's, whether or not there should be flag burning. There could be any issue out there. They'll say, hey, flag burning is dangerous. You could catch yourself on fire. Every organized medicine organization should come out against it. And we'd say, well, I think that's kind of not really a medical issue. And we'll try and not take a position on that. But you'll get people who are very passionate about that or a million other topical issues. And we try to make sure that we only focus on medicine ones. Sometimes we are in the position where we have to be very oppositional, which is not something we always like to do, and say no to things that are trying to occur. We try to be more promotional when we can, but that's not always the case. So sometimes we're very public with our support of something. Sometimes we're a little more quiet on the other side when maybe it's not something that we want to come out as being a very negative organization, I guess would be the way that I would put it. But it's always a rigorous debate. We've got people on both sides of the political aisle as part of the committee, but it's always our job as committee members to make sure that we're representing specifically POMA and what's best for all of POMA members. So, for example, I often tell people I'm a very single issue voter kind of guy. I will vote for anyone that comes out strongly against Canadian geese because I think they are terrible. They are giant vermin that just pollute the waterways. They attack people. They're vicious. I can't stand them. And if you will officially make them vermin in Pennsylvania so that you can hunt them and kill them 24/7 with no limit, you'll get my vote, guaranteed. However, as the chair, that's not really a position POMA should probably be taking. So I put my very strong political opinions aside. And I think, as a physician, what's important for physicians in Pennsylvania? And we have to take into account all physicians in Pennsylvania. I'm an employed doc, but we also have private practice docs who are on there. And we need to make sure that when we come together, we're making decisions that benefit everyone, or at least the vast majority of osteopathic physicians in Pennsylvania. So that's a not so quick description of the Government Affairs Committee.
Yeah, that was wonderful. I mean, there's no doubt that the GAC, the Government Affairs Committee, is a very diverse, very dedicated, and like you said, Hans, I mean, the work that committee does, and you in particular leading that committee, has been tremendous for our POMA members, looking out for our interests so we can continue to practice in Pennsylvania to the fullest extent for our patients. So, you brought up a point, how, the committee will make their decisions and then it goes to the board. So maybe Andy Sandusky, why don't you tell us, once the committee comes up with a position, how it goes to the board, what the board decides, then how we take that board decision, if they agree with the committee or not, and how does it then get exposed out there to others, namely our legislators, and by way of lobbying efforts and other efforts.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Thank you both for your work and for sharing. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. So We are a very member-driven organization, and we take pride in that in just about all facets of our government affairs, and that includes the decisions that are made. And they're thoughtfully brought up in the Government Affairs Committee, and as Dr. Battistella said, they go to the board. The board has its questions answered to some degree, and they can change it a little bit or they cannot. Then they pass it and becomes POMA's policy. What happens? Well, that's when your government affairs team comes in. And that is what we do when we try to ensure that whatever the organization wants, we try to accomplish in government affairs. And so one of the things I'll talk about this evening is the art of indirect lobbying. And what that is quite frankly, when osteopathic physicians are speaking with their elected officials, it's my job, it's our job as lobbying professionals to foster that communication. We aid in that communication in several different ways. The first is we provide education and information on the issues Dr. Zuckerman shared with us. Sometimes those issues are pretty involved, and we have to distill those complex issues and process into short statements of action. We also provide that information in the Under the Dome newsletter, which we put out monthly to provide the members with information that they can follow through. And when we want them to act, they can act with their elected officials. We also send out call to actions. That is when grassroots, our physician lobbyists, are needed and an inflection point in the process. And it can be an extremely powerful tool. Just as an example, one of my proudest moments as a lobbyist was when I walked into a legislator's staff office, and he turns around, he looks at me and he says, "So you're the one." I'm not sure what you mean. He said, "You're the one that's made my life miserable from Friday over to the entire weekend." And the answer was, yes, I was. And that's because the members of my organization contacted not only him and his boss, but the rest of the legislative members of a certain committee. We are lucky enough to employ voter voice software as well. And that is a software program where we can reach all of our members at a dime's notice to share with them information so that they can contact their state representatives and state senators in a timely manner. And like I said, at that critical time. And finally, what we do is we provide education. Why is it important to develop these relationships? Why is it important to contact your elected officials? Why is it important for you to share that with your lobbying team? I'll give you another example. There's nothing better than a legislator who gets up on the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate and says, "Listen, I just called my doc back home and this is what they told me." And that's how their vote was influenced. You can be that doc. And we have many osteopathic physicians that do just that, who have great relationships with their state senators and state representatives. And from the direct lobbying side of things, which Catherine will speak to in a few moments, when we need that inflection point brought up towards even higher level, that's when you as physicians can be the most powerful in the process.
That's certainly a great synopsis. I mean, the voter voice, that's a key point. Many of you out there that may be watching this podcast may say, well, we haven't seen this voter voice much. Well, we do use it, but we're not going to overuse it. We're going to use it at those very specific points where we really need to get the word out, and we really need and tell all of you to get involved on all of our behalf. So yeah, that's a great overview, Andy. Thanks so much for that. So next we have Catherine and Andy. There are contract lobbyists from Miller and Goodman. If you just give us a little overview from your perspective, political action committees and specifically POMPAC, and tell us how they can impact what we want to get done with our efforts for advocacy, and how they affect and help our association.
Well, first I'd like to say, Dr. Battistella and Dr. Zuckerman and Mr. Sandusky, I appreciate you having Catherine and myself on tonight. We very much appreciate the partnership that we have with POMA. The legislative and political action committee approach is a long and arduous process, but I would like to point out for those individuals watching this that Canadian geese and the groundhogs of Pennsylvania have a line. So there's no way that they're going to be considered vermin because the groundhogs are on board. And Punxsutawney Phil will not have that in the future. Just a little joke there.
Makes sense. There's a lot of questions.
Just a little bit about Miller and Goodman in the first place. We have been established since 1980. We have 7 lobbyists besides Catherine and myself. We are very bipartisan, and our team is built that way. You will find that your policy has friends on both sides of the aisle. Put your personal politics aside. For POMA in the future and POMA today, we are a bipartisan organization, and we have patient advocates on both sides of the aisle. And ultimately, for POMA to be successful in the legislative and the political arenas, and they are 2 separate arenas, you need to have good advocacy team. And we feel that our firm is the best in town when it comes to a bipartisan approach. And I am biased. You have to have good grassroots engagement. And we certainly do our best to get the local level. As Tip O'Neill said, all politics are local. To get the local level physicians engaged and involved, to know their legislators. I like to say to our members out there that grassroots is probably the most important spoke in that wheel. And what I mean by that is it's important to know your legislator, but it's more important for that legislator to know who you are. When they're making literally law on the floor of the House or Senate, or policy in a committee, we appreciate when they would like to reach out to you to find out your perspective. And to have that reach out from a legislator to you, it's a long-term relationship and credibility, and it takes some time, but it is a very rewarding for your patients and for your profession relationship. And I advocate for you all to do that. A good PAC, and I'm going to get into that a little bit further, and some good strategic communications, which is becoming an even more important spoke in the wheel of the legislative and political arena. As far as the PAC and Political Action Committee, that's the same thing. Political Action Committee is really built for the organization to raise and spend money on individuals that are supportive of your advocacy effort and your policy positions. It's important for me to say to you that we follow all campaign finance rules and lobbying disclosure laws, campaign finance laws. It is not quid pro quo, not at all. We look at those individuals in the House and Senate that have been supportive of our position, and obviously it's a benefit for POMA to support those individuals and keep them in office if they decide to run for re-election. House members run every 2 years, and senators run every 4 years. Gubernatorial is every 4 years as well, and this is a gubernatorial coming up. Politics, it is a bit of a blood sport, and obviously there's going to be some individuals that run against the incumbents that we support. That ultimately doesn't matter. We've had a number of members lose in elections, and ultimately we find out that the individual that has replaced them has strength in physician supporting as well. And ultimately we look at it as a case-by-case basis and support individual members through POMPAC that are supportive of POMA's legislative and policy positions. And we're very proud of what we're doing. We're pushing to get more individuals engaged in the PAC and obviously have more support within the General Assembly in Pennsylvania. A lot of times, I like to point this out for the individual members that don't realize the difference between state and federal politics, but state politics has a tremendous impact on your day in, day out lives and profession. I know that the federal side, the presidential and the US Senate and the US congressional seats seem like they get the most news coverage, and they do. But unfortunately, they don't have as much impact on your daily lives as the state representatives and state senators and the governor does on your daily lives and your profession and your patient quality of care. I am very proud of Miller and Goodman, what we do politically, but legislatively, I'm also very proud that we spend a lot of our business and our firm's strength is in healthcare and specifically scope of practice. And we have done our best, both politically and legislatively, and I'm going to turn this over to Catherine to talk about the legislative side, to strengthen that quality of care for our patients and ultimately the profession of osteopathic medicine. So Catherine, if you'd like to talk a little bit about the direct lobbying, that'd be...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great segue to it because it really is, those equal parts of grassroots communication, direct lobbying, and PAC dollars as well to be supportive of candidates that support your issues. As far as direct lobbying goes, Andy did touch on grassroots lobbying, which I think Miller and Goodman is unique in that we have really found the power of grassroots lobbying and how it can be such a huge complement to what we do in the state capitol. We always say, as much as they may love my face and Andy's face, they don't love us as much as their constituents who go to the polls and hit the lever and have a vote. It's a great collaboration, I would say, and partnership to advocate for legislation. So one thing you may be asking is, what does Miller and Goodman actually do? So what does a lobbyist do? And, kind of just 101. Our role is to have connections. In our world, networks and relationship building is key, cultivating those relationships and really establishing a presence in the state capitol will be your eyes and ears for POMA, for your membership, and also the patients that you care for. We advocate, we attempt to persuade. I say we do a lot of education with lawmakers on how an issue may directly or indirectly impact them, their constituents, and their district. We try to tie everything home. And as far as the direct lobbying goes, it may be from introducing legislation, amending legislation, negotiating a compromise, which is really key for any scope of practice issue. I'm not going to toot our own horn. Mr. Goodman is probably well known in Harrisburg for getting those compromises that take 10 to 15 years on scope of practice issues typically, which I think has really resonated well in the General Assembly because then they're not picking and choosing. We also keep track of legislation, and as I mentioned, we're the eyes and ears. So we assess the political landscape. It's hard to believe, but typically in a 2-year legislation, there's 4,000 to 5,000 bills introduced. Quite a lot of bills. Everyone has a good idea, and while a lot of those are well-intentioned, there may be unintended consequences, but we really assess the political landscape to see what actually has the momentum or may actually get a committee vote. And when Andy Sandusky references the voter voice, and maybe you don't see it that often, that's because there's only so many times you can ask someone to take action, right? So we don't want to, like every bill introduced, we don't want to call you and sound the alarms, because the reality is that most bills don't actually make it out of committee. So it's really good to have a lobbyist who understands the political landscape. If there is a bill that's introduced that has negative impact on the profession, we make sure that we meet with the key legislators, the key staff, educate them on the position, give them the good and bad. One thing we do pride ourselves on is that we're very credible and honest. So we'll tell our side, we'll also let them know what the other side may say as well, give them the information and hope that they make the best decision possible. But that's all part of our credibility with lobbying. In addition to cultivating those champions, we will identify legislative sponsors. Anyone can introduce a bill, but there's really a science that goes down to it, making sure that there's bipartisan support. We have a Republican-controlled General Assembly and a Democratic administration. So any bill that's going to actually get signed into law has to be bipartisan with everyone on board. We also help with drafting legislation, filing those. And also another big thing is coalition building, working with other stakeholders to really either pump up the momentum to get something done. I know there's a lot of activity right now and stakeholders involved in a coalition on prior authorization. And there was a lot of activity in a coalition involved on defeating balanced billing legislation that would have had a negative impact on your practices, your profession, but also your patients. So there's a lot of benefits, and we also help navigate the bill through a very complex legislative process, and it's meant to be complex. Otherwise, as I mentioned, there's 5,000 bills, and certainly we wouldn't want everything rushed to the governor's desk and signed into law. So that's a little bit about our role. I don't know if there's anything. I'll stop for a moment if there's any questions or any commentary.
I think these are all great points, and this discussion just totally proves, what we do at POMA. It's truly a team approach, from the committee structure to the board to our consultants and contract lobbyists, everyone really is for the common goal for our osteopathic physicians and our patients. And this discussion tonight is just a beautiful example of that. I mean, it truly shows, how we have such diverse people with specific, not goals, but talents, and they all bring something to the table for the benefit of our association. So we really appreciate that. I'll just ask the panel members, does anyone else have anything that they wanted to throw out there and discuss with us this evening?
Yeah, Dr. Battistella, I'd just like to add that to Catherine's comments that the absolute best lobbying our firm can do on behalf of POMA is follow up to a local physician's conversation. If a local physician has reached out to his or her legislator, local House member, local senator, and briefed that senator or House member on an issue, our follow-up is the most powerful lobbying we can possibly do. And that's why the grassroots engagement, good advocacy team, the good PAC, all combined just creates a success for POMA and ultimately your patients. And that's why we're here. We're very proud.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Hans, Andy, any last words?
Just that I think it's important to emphasize that when we look at these bills and different legislation that's coming through, we really do try and prioritize what's best for patients first. We talk a lot about, trying to think about osteopathic physicians and everything, but really the patients of osteopathic physicians always come first. And Catherine's right when she talks about how many bills are out there, and you get a lot that show up in these committees and they're poorly written, and you can just tell that the person it was like handed something and they just kind of throw it in there, and it has all these unintended consequences. And so oftentimes the committee will be like, you can look at it and it's either never going to make it out of committee, or it's going to be heavily modified before it does. And it might be something that we kind of gloss over and don't pay a whole lot of attention to. But then the next day it's in the news because of those unintended consequences, make it kind of a really sexy news story about how terrible, this party or that party is trying to make healthcare or ruin whatever for people. And it's just kind of funny. Actually, it's not funny as much as it is really nice to have such a good team put together, where you see these in the news now and you immediately know, okay, this is how that happened. It's not serious. This isn't something that POMA has to jump on, but we will have Andy Sandusky go over there or Andy Goodman go over there and be like, hey guys, here's a way that we could probably make this better, because what you're doing right now is borderline embarrassing you. And we need to make sure that you're not getting a lot of bad press. So it allows us to go in and make some suggestions to people to helpfully achieve the goals they're trying to do, but in a more proper way. So you may not see POMA, published under the dome that we're reaching out to try and make a bill better, but we are working a lot behind the scenes to do that. And you never know when a mild conversation with a legislator does make a big difference. I always forget that my legislator has an office in the small local mall. And so every once in a while, if I'm there to, pick up a greeting card or something like that, or something for the office, I'll stop by and just see if he's in there and kind of poke my head in and say, hey, this is what we talked about. Do you remember me? So-and-so. And usually he's not there and I just talk to one of the staff members. But it is one of those things that you never know when a comment about something is going to make a big difference. And he's called me back. If I stop in and say, hey, I want to talk about issue A, B, or C, he'll call me back and listen to what I have to say and hang up the phone. And you don't always know how much influence that has, but the more you do it, the more you end up building up that relationship. And he may have his own personal physician who just isn't very politically active and doesn't know a lot about some of the issues. So having someone that he knows is more on top of things as part of a committee like this and active in POMA makes a difference.
Yeah, if I could add on to that, I think you brought up a great point, Dr. Zuckerman, and that is sometimes there's a whole lot going on behind the scenes that not too many people get to see. We are blessed to have, the team that we have all around, from the physician, from the patients to the physicians, to your lobbying team, to the committees that we have, to the board that we have. We are blessed. We're not surprised all that often. What I mean is that we do our homework, and Andy, Catherine, and the entire Milliron Goodman team is always on the Hill and always have their ear to the ground. And anytime that something good or bad happens, we usually get a call 3 or 4 days before that. That's not an exaggeration, and that's a great thing. But again, your point is I can't stress it enough. There is just so much going on, so many conversations going on, especially when the legislature is in town, down in Harrisburg. It's just mind-boggling. And just know that osteopathic physicians and their patients are the beginning and the end of, our discussions with those legislators as it relates to the Pennsylvania Osteopathic Medical Association.
Pennsylvania is a challenging state. I don't know how many people realize that most states, and I'm not even sure what the numbers are, maybe someone can enlighten me, don't have year-round legislature. So it's not like we only need to be active in a full court press, like, 1 or 2 seasons a year. It's all the time. They have breaks, but there's never like a 6 or 8 months period where the legislator is just inactive.
That's 100% correct. Some of my past experience has been with other states. There's very few that operate like Pennsylvania. I think there's a couple. There's Ohio, New Jersey. They go year round and they both have 2-year legislative sessions. But what they don't have are full-time legislators. And that's what we have in Pennsylvania. I think we're one of 3. Don't quote me on that, but there's very few that this is their full vocation. Many of the other states, the vast majority of them, are front-end states that go from anywhere from 30 to 90 days or 6 months in that beginning period. And you're right, Dr. Zuckerman, then the rest of that time they go back to do whatever it is they do for their day job, for those 6 months or 3 months, and they start it all over again. You are correct. Pennsylvania is a very challenging state in terms of the volume of bills, as Catherine shared with you, the number of issues, and the length of time that it takes to get something accomplished isn't 30 days. It's sometimes 2 years, a 2-year session, 4 years, and even 6 years to get that issue to fully mature and have the impact that you want. That was just an idea 6 years hence.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that. I don't know that everyone realizes, obviously everyone on this podcast does, but in our General Assembly, we're dealing with 253 different personalities, different lawmakers with different, priorities. And I think one thing that, when I first, I'm going to age myself, but when I'll bring Andy into this too. When Andy and I started out in this world, it was not uncommon that legislators were there for years, 30 plus years. So it was very easy to cultivate those champions. They were well aware of the issues and kind of subject matter experts, so to speak. But now we've seen such a huge turnover in our General Assembly, especially since 2005. I don't know that there's anyone remaining. I think we've seen almost a complete turnover. So every 2 years with each election cycle, it's a new class of freshmen, we call them. And, really that education period begins all over again. So it's been more challenging, but also it's great to be able to get in there up front and educate them on POMA's issues. But yeah, it's a different landscape than what we've seen when we first started. And I would say we're very well positioned moving forward, because when we started, those members that were the rank and file and freshmen are now running the show. So we've also learned people focus mainly on leaders. We also work very well with the rank and file, because some days those are your future leaders.
Yeah, and I think it only reinforces the grassroots engagement. I keep talking about this, but those legislators not being there for 30 years and being there much shorter, they're much more localized, and they very much like hearing from local physicians, local patients, local constituents. It's just critically important in 2022, and it's really empowered Miller and Goodman and POMA, because we do have such a good, strong grassroots engagement level.
Excellent. Well, I think we talked about this even before the podcast, and we could probably be on here for hours talking. I'm sure between the stories and the things that are going on and things we anticipate going on later this year, we could have this discussion till the election in November, probably, but maybe we shouldn't. So thank you all for participating. I'd just like to say, besides all the people on this, the committee members, the POMA staff, we can't thank them enough. That's really what makes the POMA team go. And hopefully some of you people that are watching this podcast, maybe this sparks an interest in something. Maybe you want to get involved with one of our committees, our work groups, our task forces. We'd love to have you on board. We're easy to reach. POMA is just a phone call away. You can reach us on the internet, and we have a POMA app. So just reach out to us, and we'll see you in the next podcast And actually, our upcoming podcast, Jen Grozowski, who leads the Public Policy Committee, wasn't involved in this because she's going to be leading the next podcast, which will be involved with POMA public policy.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Battistella.
And stay safe out there. Be well.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of POMA Does. Be sure to subscribe to POMA Does wherever you listen to your podcasts, and tell your friends and colleagues to tune in. Learn more about osteopathic medicine and POMA on our webpage, www.poma.org, and join the conversation on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, or email us at poma@poma.org. We'd love to hear from you. Join us next time for another edition of POMA Does.